invite all the speakers to sit side by side and see if there are any questions from the panel. Otherwise, I have several points.
Anna, 5 questions for you. Obviously, yours is like a very successful version of an artist-run initiative, and it's almost like the opposite of Helen's, almost like in a funny way. Like yours is trying to stay small, trying to reach everybody. And, what do you think? Do you think there's a, I just looking at the contrast in that when does it get out of hand? Do you know what I mean? When it gets too big and everyone's fighting to get into your, it's not for the small people, the emerging artists anymore, it's for everyone who wants a big show, at first.
Sorry, can you just introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name's Catherine. I'm formerly from Data, so I'm project manager there.
And can you just clarify, before I hand over to the answer, what do you mean by opposite in terms of size?
Maybe in terms of audio, like Helen was talking about a niche market.
Right.
And this is more like, obviously trying to reach everybody.
Yeah.
Well,
maybe I'll start by answering this from a personal story. I grew up in very country Queensland on a big property, and the first time I ever knew that contemporary art was something that existed in the world, I was about 20 years old. So, I grew up studying mechatronic engineering, how far off point was I? So potentially what attracts me to First Draft is that idea that, and what I believe of the institution is that as much as it is competitive, the nature of, or part of the nature of contemporary art practice is to be in this field and to make sure that you're engaging in it in not a competitive way, but in a way that is contemporary, and that you're making sure that you're going to exhibitions and you're seeing what is happening in your world. So, as much as it is potentially a more a competitive process of application, it doesn't mean that no one gets exhibitions, or you have to be well known to get exhibitions. That's not at all the case. Or you have to have some mega CV. There's been a lot of people who have showed at First Draft, and it may be their first real exhibition or solo exhibition or professionalised exhibition after art school. And we really do try and maintain that as a core. In saying that, I'm aware that Brendan and Consuelo are not necessarily emerging, but in the, Brendan collaborated with another artist, James Dodd, for that project, and Consuelo was there as an emerging curator, and we wanted to engage in that practice just as much as showing someone who's having their first exhibition. Now, getting back to where I was going with my story of I'm from the country, but I like the fact that First Draft does have this sort of approachability as well, in that we want people to know about us and we want people to engage with us, because there are a lot of people who potentially maybe new to the arts world or be an engineer, and then think, oh wow, what is this other thing? And we try and display ourselves as such, I suppose. And not to say that having a niche audience is at all bad, and incredibly, I'm sure that we do have a very niche audience, but it's more that if someone from another art form or another practice entirely is interested in engaging into contemporary art, we'd like to think that we offer a space and a place for that to happen. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I think also, obviously, because we've been around for such a long time, 30 years, that I'm 30, so maybe I'm this embodied version of First Draft somehow. So our knowledge is young, but it's very old at the same time, and we're still, making mistakes and getting things wrong and right. And I think this rotating board is really integral in that sort of continuation of it being artist-led and focused, potentially.
Can you introduce yourself?
My name's Matthew, and I work at McMahon as a media officer. I was wondering if the rest of the panel could talk a bit, well, give their thoughts on what Helen was saying about the more like group discussion model of artist talks, given that artist talks can sometimes be a bit like an albatross around the neck or whatever of art space or whatever.
So you can try.
Like maybe you could also talk a bit more about that. Like, is there like a resolved solution or whatever to artist talks, or and what do you guys think of that model of artist talk? And that's what
Is it to Anne or to Helen or to just about everyone?
everybody in Yeah.
I suppose, yeah, what Robert said about the contemporary sort of artist always, the intention being really what's driving everything. Well, if the intention of the artist is not to talk about their work, I suppose that's just as important. And I know a lot of artists that just will say, I don't talk about my work, but in the opposite way, there's a lot of artists that want to talk about their work endlessly. So it's really just up to whoever that individual is to negotiate that. And there's never a clear model of how that will happen or how to facilitate it. So it's really just understanding what the audience is wanting to get out of that and trying to drive it from there, and what the artists are trying to get out of it as well.
Can I say something on this topic? It's kind of interesting because I used to teach, unfortunately, for my students. But obviously, when you're at art school, you have to speak. That is part of what you have to do. Also, you have to talk about your work when you apply for a grant. You have to talk about your work when you approach a gallery. You have to talk about your work when you write a press release. And either you or someone else has to talk about your work when you write, when you have an exhibition, you want to have a catalog essays. And I completely understand why some artists or many artists don't want to discuss their work, because they think that what they might be able to articulate verbally is not going to match what's in the work. But there is this situation in which, also being a writer myself, not so much lately, the artists, what they want like a ventriloquist dummy, and that is the writer. So they want someone that speaks for them and says the right things about their work in a catalog essay or in a review, but they want to kind of stand back. So I'm not sure if there is a contradiction there. I actually stopped writing catalog essay for individual exhibition for social, simply because I felt that I was implicitly or explicitly, the ventriloquist dummy. I don't know whether you, as artist, writing, curator, what are your thoughts about this issue? Actually, we are interested in theory and criticism, so you want an idea, Helen?
So I stopped writing catalogue essays where possible in the last year, only because my PhD was due and I ended up writing a lot of them, they were unchecked. But as regards to artist talk, I think a good strategy is to, if the artist doesn't want to talk about their work, get them talking about something else close to the work. So for instance, Helen Johnson, who's a Melbourne painter, she recently did her PhD in fine art at Monash University, and she battled the bureaucrats very, she tackled them and said, I don't want to write a 30,000 word exegesis on my work, I want to write about painters who are significant to my practice. So Juan Davila, Martin Kiepenberger, people like that. And her PhD was beautiful. It didn't talk about her work, but it illuminated her work infinitely. So I think that's a good approach.
I don't know that I have an opinion on this. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you have to say that. Gemma is a local curator and...
sorry, I'm Gemma. I'm a curator at Art Gallery, and I do some other stuff as well. I was following on because it's focused very much on, I suppose, history and theory, whether it was created as a response to a deficit perceived in the art schools, or whether it was sort of fostered by focusing in the art schools on theory and history.
So you're asking, just because I don't know if everyone heard what you said. So you're asking whether Helen's initiative was a response to a certain lack of critical discussion at art school level,
or whether it continued on.
Or they continued
as
on.
such at art school.
Well, I didn't go to art school. I did my PhD in art history, and in fact, most of the writers in discipline are sort of more art historians than, apart from Helen, she's one of our key writers and she's an artist. There's definitely no lack of interest in theory or critical discussion in Melbourne, at least. Like there are so many reading groups operating at the moment, but there is a lack of sort of serious writing on kind of like younger contemporary artists, because there just aren't that many forums for sort of long-form research-based writing. I mean, I'm just trying to think, like Broadsheet under Alan Cruikshank publishes, up to sort of 4,000 words maybe, but the only other journals I can really think of are EMAG and Triple ANZ, and they only have about 6 articles per, 12 months. So it was more, the thinking was there, just the platform wasn't. Does that make sense? Perhaps now I have the microphone.
Okay.
Yes, I've got to ask Robert a question, because I noticed that you mentioned that I can't remember the wording exactly, but you're opposed to criticism as a methodology, but more about writing about art, and I just wondered whether you might elaborate on those categories.
Maybe. I've had a bee in my bonnet about this since forever, since maybe I was an art critic at the West Australian, and I don't know, I was probably a really super bad art critic. I probably was too involved in like the West Australian ethos, and kind of like you are shaped by the context. And so anyway, so that set me off on a weird path. Sorry man, I forgot the question.
Well, it was about the distinction between criticism, art criticism, and writing about.
Oh, okay. I don't know, I live in this fantasy world that's absolutely unconnected to any of the worlds that you guys live in. And in my fantasy world, I see culture existing in a pure arena of, like I was saying, kind of YouTube exchanges. And I think that criticism needs to happen by way of, like I said, soft cultural evolution, about someone copying and someone moving back. It's almost like a call and response thing, like early blues or something. And I think it should operate in a different realm. And I think kind of bringing it out, you've got some bloody hectoring critic kind of at you. It's like, it's just so irrelevant. Christopher Allen stuff in the Australian, or anything that I read pretty much anywhere, it's just some kind of person's, it hasn't come from anywhere. It's kind of coming down, where kind of criticism, I think, should be implicit in kind of what follows. Like writers are inspired by other writers, they're not inspired by Harold Bloom. And I think writing about, when it's not just press release stuff, it should be its own genre. This is something Ben Forster and I, when we did our magazines, tried to do, to kind of set art writers free from the art, to see what would happen if there was like a parallel discourse that artists would maybe be inspired by, or there would be some kind of more fluid exchange of equals. So I think how the hierarchies are set up are really bad and awful. That probably doesn't make sense.
Just my turn to ask a question to all of you, and that is following up on this discussion about criticism, which I think was one of the focus of this section anyway. There is a famous, I don't have the reference with me, of course, but on October magazine there was a forum discussion on the death of the critic, of the art critic, more than in fact, I was interested, you mentioned about the death of the curator, because in fact, the general opinion is that the rise of the curator destroyed the critic. So we don't have a situation anymore like, in the 60s when Clement Greenberg was able to destroy or create the career of the artist through his critical writing. And the situation becomes even murkier when the role of curator and critic mix up. And so, obviously when we're talking about criticism, we need to make a distinction between, what happens on the West Australian or the Australian, which is, a short-term reaction and written for a certain reader, and what you're trying to do with discipline, which is much more, if you like, engaged and thought out way of thinking about that. So my question is the critic dead? And if it's not the first question, the second question is, when we're talking about critical writing, what role evaluation has in the response, critic response, or art writer response to an artwork? By evaluation, I mean good, bad, important, strong, weak.
Well, to answer the question about evaluation first, I think I totally agree with Robert. Well, I agree and disagree. Like, I would never agree that the kind of newspaper critics we have, I would never call them a critic in the first place, because I just don't think they are. But the question, I do agree with you when you say that like they're useless because they evaluate, flippantly. And I think the role of criticism is certainly evaluation is a part of it, but it's only the concluding part of it. I think a good critic establishes the framework for the criteria of criticism first. So it would be a useless judgment if you didn't establish what you were judging the writer or the artist or curator in the first place. And the first question about critics and curators, I think they both serve very similar purposes. They both sort of play the role of mediating artwork to a public, and they take on the responsibility of trying to establish what is important for a public to know about and understand. But I don't think that the curator has killed the critic. I think they've enriched the critic's role by making it more sort of specific and giving them more things to complain about.
I was just going to point out that there's this sort of negativity around the word critic, I think, but there's not the same negativity around the word critical, and they're quite similar, maybe. And I think, I don't think that there's the death of either of these things. I think that there's a blurring of all of the things, maybe that's what's happening. I don't know. I did a master's in art curatorship and felt like I didn't really learn anything except maybe that the art history department and the sort of visual art school were very different bodies, and that there should be more interaction between those two things. That just didn't happen. But I think that curators and critics are still alive and out there, but I think that the form of their presence is different. Maybe it's on Facebook now, I don't know. There's lots of really great discussions that happen on Facebook around exhibitions, I think, or Instagram, emojis.
Are there any more questions? Because otherwise,
I was reading an article. I'm Graham Hale, an artist in an artist space near here. There's an article in the Atlantic newspaper which was reproduced, I think, in the Australian a couple of months ago, and they were saying that basically with the new technology we've moved from the age which is past post-critic, post-curator, and the argument is that in the age of the artisan, judgment rested with the patron. In the age of the professional, rested with the critic, and I define us as the age of the critic because we are, most of it I gather from speakers in the audience questions, tertiary qualified or have links with tertiary institutions, or like Robert, curators and so on, employed as professionals in the arts community. What they're saying is we're now moving to the age the genius. They're going to call the new age the age of genius, where anybody can be creative, and the decision about taste no longer rests with gatekeepers like critics and curators, because the public can just go on Instagram or Pinterest and collect images and artworks and video and talk about social media. So we've actually moved past that, and most of the emerging artists I can see are multi-skilling, and they're doing some writing, they're doing some set building, they're doing some running a studio, they're making art, they're doing everything. But we're now being sold, the public are being sold not art, being sold the means to make their own art. They can write on a digital device, they can draw a device, they can manually create an artwork, and they can print it out. So in some ways we are just talking to a smaller and smaller group of people, like-minded people, in an environment where government funding and private sector funding for the arts is decreasing. And so the university is shedding staff, art gallery shedding staff, the library is shedding staff, and so the public now are digitally consuming and creating their own artwork. And I just wonder what the panel thinks about that change, because we are operating in a closed circuit. The swimming pool is getting smaller, and we're talking to ourselves. Are we actually outside? I know they're talking about connecting with the public and so on later this afternoon, but I think we need to be aware that we are increasingly talking to a smaller group of people that are conditioned a particular way by institutions, which are becoming perhaps redundant.
Got questions about the role of social media, whether social media has undermined, in a positive way, the kind of previous role of gatekeepers, individual gatekeeper, institutionally.
I know so much about social media, not being on Facebook. I know like anything that's happening in the world on that kind of realm or whatever happens there. So therefore, I think it's the best thing ever. I think exactly what I was trying to say about these kind of mutations. Like, if everyone's an artist, that's amazing, because things will move in kind of different ways. And I think artists who are important acknowledge that and kind of develop it. And I think it's a good space for us to be in. I think it's more open. Sometimes it can be a little bit weird when like Kanye West is curating everything now, and he's making his Adidas whatever sneakers that have just dropped. Yeah, all of that stuff's really brilliant. You know, the only problem is that it's couched in commercialism too much, right? So there's that, but there's something about the energy that I think is really exciting. And this is not an answer to the question, but maybe to another question while I've got a microphone. I think over time the role of the curator has shifted. So we've been talking about the death of the curator, and that's something I absolutely feel very strongly. When I started as a curator, I didn't go to curating school. About the death of the curator? No, I think the death of the, at least in my experience, there is a death of the curator and whatever. But there's other curators like Kanye and stuff, and that's amazing. I mean that genuinely. I think it's really positive. But in my time...
It's impossible not to be a curator. It's really difficult.
Well, yeah, you created your outfit, and yeah. It's wonderful, and I think it's creative. Yeah, I think it's great. I've noticed a shift in the profession over however long I've been doing this thing. When I started being a curator, I thought I had a lot of agency to kind of make narratives and make meaning and kind of really frame things. And I came out of, kind of PhD thing where I believed in the ideals of post-structuralism. I thought that, meaning belonged to everybody, and, interpretation was a creative act. And what I've learned over 15 years or something as a curator is that it's not the case anymore. And that in terms of my profession, I've moved from like making meaning to having an editorial relationship with an artist, which is incredibly fulfilling. And I think the best thing, to then being a conduit, or as Marco said, like a ventriloquist. It's not something I feel necessarily, but basically my job is to facilitate the voice of the artist. And as I see the role developing, it's to be a better and better facilitator, more organized, more charming, and to kind of lessen the friction between the institution and the artist. So I see that as being the role of the curator now. yet obviously Lars Bang Larsen is doing whatever he's doing, and he's famous curators, and they do a very different thing. There's kind of the spectacle with kind of so-called criticality behind it, which I don't believe in. Anyway, rant, somebody.
So I had something to say. Now it's come back. Right. So I sort of, I don't know, I'm writing my master's paper on my own work at the moment, and I'm finding that really difficult because I sort of don't consider myself really good at anything. And I think maybe that's the thing. I sort of am writing it about, sorry. I'm a great curator because I'm a professional dilettante. And maybe that also makes me an okay artist as well. But I think there's this sort of maybe a rise of this idea of someone who is aware of a lot of things and is engaged in a lot of things, but not necessarily an expert in any of them. And that there's a value in that because it's coming in with a fresh approach to all of those things that you don't really know everything about. And in fact, there's this sort of issue that I have with the fact that no one can really know everything about anything. So then there's, that's just ridiculous, isn't it? So you can't ever be an expert. But also with social media, I don't know really where I was going with that, but social media, I don't know, I run the First Draft Instagram account, and I took that over at the beginning of this year, and I just make ridiculous, films, really, about the shows with Taylor Swift songs in the background, and I think that that this sort of social media platform of engagement is interesting. I'm not really sure how I don't know how to. What was the question specifically about? Now I'm lost.
Well, ARI, a shrinking pond.
Oh, shrinking pond.
Because outside the pond, everybody is now an artist because everybody's got digital devices.
Everyone's making a film on their Instagram account. Yeah. So maybe, that's great. I'm pretty keen on everyone being an artist if they want to. But it's the difference between whether it's good or not, and that's really hard to decide as well. I suppose that's when Kanye West becomes a really great artist, maybe. I don't know. I think this is all defined by the individual. And taste is a really weird thing to talk about now, somehow, in this world of everything being accessible and okay and cool. Maybe I would like to say that I think emojis are quite good in their criticality, and it's amazing what you can have a whole discussion based on 200 characters. Anyway.
I don't really wrap it up, but I'll just say in one sentence, I'm not sure how the social media phenomenon produces a smaller pool of fish or pond of fish. Presumably it's much, much bigger. But also I think the biggest danger or perhaps interesting factor about criticism of social media and being an artist is this Joseph Boycean idea of everyone's an artist, but if everyone's an artist and it's because of this constant mediation through Facebook and a curatorial culture presenting ourselves as subjects with interests or whatever to potentially infinite audience, then it leaves very little time for not working or not being an artist. And so I've recently become very interested in the Wages for Facebook kind of campaign, which is this idea that because Facebook is capitalising on our data and our performance in the social media, we should be being paid for it. And I think it is important to recognise that even though we think we're kind of slacking off by checking Facebook, we're also performing an identity which is also connected to our artistic or curatorial or intellectual practices, and someone's capitalising on it, if not us. So I don't know, it's worth thinking about how you might refuse that kind of labour.
Yes, okay, I think we need to wrap it up. Can you please thank you, our speakers.